for us this evening. So Ruth Beale is in my top left. Heather?
I can see, brilliant.
Yeah.
I was just going to suggest something, Poppy.
Hello, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's great to see so many of you join from different places across the UK and beyond, I think. As you may know, we had to reschedule this event due to illness, and we're really grateful for those of you who were able to stay with us. My name is Poppy Bowers, and I am curator at the Whitworth. The Whitworth is a university art gallery based in the city of Manchester, where we present exhibitions from our collection and with artists that respond to current artistic and social urgencies. Our current exhibition takes up the subject of art and economy, and it provides the frame for this evening's talk. The exhibition is called Economics the Blockbuster. It's not business as usual, and it opened at the Whitworth on the 30th of June, and it runs until this Sunday. So there's still a bit of time for you to see it if you haven't and if you're nearby in the region. The exhibition brings together 10 contemporary art projects from England, Wales, and further afield, the Netherlands, Central Africa, and Indonesia, amongst some places. And each artwork in the show demonstrates how artists are working collaboratively within the communities in which they are part to test new forms of economy. And these self-organized systems rethink and reorganize value production and income distribution to build more equitable, diverse, and sustainable communities. And a core intention of the exhibition is very simply to demonstrate an understanding of economy as being more than flows of finance, as important as they can be, and to show ways in which economy is enacted and sustained in many diverse ways through interdependent networks of human and more than human worlds. Economy is a common daily social and cultural practice. As part of the exhibition, we commissioned a new work by the Alternative School of Economics, which is a collaboration between artists Ruth Beale and Amy Feneck, who are hosting tonight's discussion, and they will introduce themselves more fully. The Alternative School of Economics are going to lead the discussion. So once I go through some of the housekeeping, I'll hand over to them. Titled We Are Not a Burden to Each Other, tonight's discussion explores the antagonistic relationship between work and care within a capitalist economy. And this is part of Amy and Ruth's work, a new commissioned work for the show, which is titled The Neoliberal Imagination. And it comprises an installation of a dystopian cabin, a library, a wall map, audio guides, and a series of discussions, of which this evening is part. And together, these components prompt us to consider the way in which neoliberal values manifest in and give shape to our daily lives. And more specifically, they respond to the ways in which neoliberal conditions limit our capacity to imagine ourselves and our world otherwise. So we're really pleased to welcome Sophie Lewis and Jo Ller to the conversation this evening. And I'd like to thank you both, along with Ruth and Amy, for enabling this event tonight. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Holly Shuttleworth, the producer of the exhibition and of this event, and Evan Wilson and Maria Morahu at School of Digital Arts for providing the tech expertise for this evening. Before I hand over to Amy and Ruth to lead the event, I'll just run through the timings. Amy and Ruth are going to introduce their practice and the project in the exhibition for about 10 minutes, I think. And then Sophie Lewis and Jo Ller will speak for 15 minutes each on their own research and practice. And then Amy and Ruth will lead an open discussion for about 45 minutes. And throughout that, we'll be feeding in questions and reflections that you share yourselves who are attending. And we encourage you to share those in the chat function at the side of the screen. We'll be monitoring this throughout the session, so please don't wait towards the end. Do throw them in when they rise. We do have quite a large number of people signed up for tonight, so we might not get to everybody's comments and questions, but we will try. So I'm going to hand over to the brilliant speakers here this evening, who will touch on ideas that connect to us all in different ways. We acknowledge that notions of family and care can mean different things to everyone. And first and foremost, we want to create a caring space here online where we can listen and hold difference. And I thank you all in advance for your openness to the conversation and for your respectful attention. Thank you. And Amy and Ruth, over to you.
Thanks, Poppy. I think Amy's just going to get the slides up. But as she's doing that, I'll just say, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Poppy and the Whitworth for hosting this event. It's really excited to hear from Jo and Sophie and to have this discussion. Before we hand over to our speakers and have that discussion, we're going to briefly talk about our project, the Neoliberal Imagination, and the idea behind this title, We Are Not a Burden to Each Other, and introduce the speakers for tonight's conversation as well. So as the Alternative School of Economics, just to introduce that concept first, we make art that questions economic doctrine and knowledge hierarchies. And we look at global political issues and how they connect to political ones. And we use feminist organising, creative processes and alternative economics as forms of resistance within that. So for Economics Blockbuster and this exhibition, we wanted to explore the idea of neoliberalism. And it's a term that's used a lot in academia and cultural critique, and for some people it's very familiar, but for some it's really not. It's not kind of an everyday language. So I'm just going to describe what it is. It's an economic philosophy that promotes free trade, deregulation, globalisation, and a reduction in government. Many people are familiar with it in the way that it was promoted by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and it continues to be the dominant political doctrine. So we were interested in how pervasive neoliberalism is, how it's an economic idea that seeps into everything, including the way that we imagine things, and our capacity to imagine things differently. So how we interact and care for each other, and how actually that pervasiveness can be really kind of damaging and violent.
I'm sorry, guess what? There's a problem with the sharing. Hang on. There we go. So as the Alternative School of Economics, we often take a subject and research it with other people as a kind of form of collective self-education. And in Manchester, we talk to striking workers about how their sort of direct action is an attempt to fight against the neoliberal policies affecting public services. We held some workshops and had conversations online, and also did stuff at the Whitworth. And these conversations and workshop experiments informed part of the installation, which we then made for the exhibition.
I'm not seeing the slides change, Amy.
No. Okay, sorry.
It's like the border version. I don't know if you've got one without.
Let's try this. Sorry about this.
Yes, I can see that one. Great.
Is that okay? Apologies for that.
That's okay. So this is the installation. This is the work that's in the Whitworth at the moment. And there's these set-like structures. You can see the drawn cabin, and it's a sort of dilapidated cabin structure, and it's inspired by Ursula Le Guin's book, The Lathe of Heaven, and the idea that in the book the main character's dreams come true, and as his unconscious changes the world around him, everything changes. And one of the things in the book is that he dreams of owning this cabin in the wilderness that he can escape to, and at the end everything collapses. The cabin collapses, the fabric of the world itself, everything sort of disintegrates. So that's the cabin.
And then at the centre of this cabin, at the centre of the installation, is a series of audio guides for the imagination, which take you through 5 different situations, some quite everyday, some more fantastical. And in these guides, you're asked to use your imagination to relate to ideas attached to neoliberalism, such as individualism or monetization, or choice and accumulation. And the idea is to kind of recognize, to see if you can recognize your reactions or responses to neoliberal ideas, to see how it's affecting you and or your imagination. And to ultimately, we were interested in kind of using the imagination as a tool for thinking outside of neoliberalism. And then, as you can see in these other images, within the cabin, within this sort of dilapidated dwelling, we have these 4 banners, which were made by Manchester-based union member Lou Miller. And they each carry a phrase that tries to counter the characteristics or consequences of neoliberal economics. And they were informed by these conversations that we were having with striking workers. The phrases are not kind of straightforward demands or political slogans necessarily, but try and reach into the feelings of living and working in neoliberalism and kind of try to offer alternative ways of thinking about what work, value and society could be. And the intention is that these banners will be used by the UCU union once the exhibition is finished. And this is the banner that we're talking about today.
Yeah, and as Amy said, like working with those striking workers was so central to developing this work and different aspects of that installation. So this phrase actually came from a striking paramedic. I don't know if she's hopefully here, in the audience tonight, talking about the burden felt by people in work and care, and especially unpaid elder care, and how that was, how that affects her in her work as a paramedic. This notion of a burden is it's also sort of used by politicians and invoked to sort of demonize all sorts of people, like those accessing welfare and benefits, migrants and refugees. We also talk about a tax burden. It's a word that kind of crops up a lot. Lou's design, we really love it. It appropriates the Saatchi and Saatchi infamous Conservative Party billboard that said Labour isn't working, which was then also appropriated by Nigel Farage in reference to immigration during the Vote Leave campaign. So it's really kind of flipping this around, and this banner's a hopeful banner, and it's really against that idea that Thatcher had, that there's no society, only individuals and families. It's twisting it around. which brings us to this evening's conversation and to the speakers that we've invited.
So we just wanted to sort of introduce this ideas a bit more and talk a bit more about this idea of care in the economy. So both industrial capitalism and neoliberal capitalism rely on the family as a form of privatized and often unpaid, a privatized and often unpaid care system. So it's like this has been called social reproduction. So the idea of supporting and caring for the workers who keep the economy going. And neoliberal sort of economic mechanisms like public service cuts and the shrinking of the state and privatization mean that a healthcare system outside of the family is not supported. And there's also a lot of what came through from discussing with different people about this topic is the idea of individualizing the problem, and so the sort of self-care industry, which is boomed, and there's this idea that instead of looking to society for help, it's up to you to kind of solve everything, and this makes us even more atomized and competitive and vulnerable. So essentially we're kind of saying that neoliberalism doesn't care about care unless it makes a profit.
And speaking with those union workers gave us, like, I suppose this is one kind of conversation that we're having. So speaking with the union workers gave us the opportunity to hear directly how care was affecting them in their sectors. We also held a public workshop in the exhibition where we used those audio guides as a shared listening tool to create discussion about the way our bodies and minds relate to neoliberalism and to conjure alternative possibilities. And this gives us a chance to have a different kind of conversation. We're really interested in what feminist economics and queer perspectives might be able to teach us about care in the economy. In the Care Manifesto, the authors describe themselves as socialist eco-feminists. And we're interested to hear their perspectives on how care needs to change, how current structures of care either struggle to survive or prop it up, and what our economy and society might be like if care was at the centre. So we're really excited to have two brilliant feminist thinkers join us tonight, Jo Ller and Sophie Lewis. I think Amy's going to begin by introducing Jo.
Yeah, so I'll stop sharing. Okay. So Jo Ller is co-author as part of the Care Collective of the Care Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence, which asks what it would be like if we made care the central organising principle of our lives. Jo is Professor of Cultural, Media and Social Analysis at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her other books include Against Meritocracy, Culture, Power and Myths of Mobility, and the new collection of interviews, Left Feminisms, Conversations on the Personal and the Political. If I can hand over to you now, Jo. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll just put my slides up. Okay, can you see them? Yeah, great. Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here with the Alternative School for Economics to talk alongside Sophie and to be hosted by the Whitworth. So I'm just sorry we can't be there in person because I spent a fair amount of time in Manchester art galleries as a teenage nerd. So the title of this event, We Are Not a Burden to Each Other, is, I think, so good because it moves the lens that contemporary capitalism endlessly tries to make us look through, which says that people are burdens to our own individualized development. And instead, it celebrates our interwoven existence, our interconnectedness, the fact that we need each other to subsist and exist, to create meaning and create collective joy. So I really love this shining beacon of statement, which tells us to care for each other and to move away from that story, not to treat each other as burdens, but as each other's support systems for life. Even though, and at the same time, within our current system of capitalism, whatever we might call it, techno-feudal capitalism or neoliberal nationalism, we cannot help but be burdens to each other, because our working hours are far too long and we are not given enough time to care. Because our health systems have been marketised and underfunded and don't treat us early enough. Because our social care has been cut to the bone, so the elderly and sick are neglected and abandoned. Because local council budgets have been slashed in half in 10 years, so they provide less social housing, close libraries and shut down community centres. Because our schools have been taken over by corporations who exclude pupils at twice the previous rate. Because there's uneven access to extortionate childcare and reproductive rights are under threat. Because there's uneven access to, sorry, I just said that bit, because our governments endorse brutal war crimes and scapegoat migrants and have not phased out fossil fuels. So for all these reasons and for more, we cannot help but be a burden to each other. And the list just goes on, it's not exhaustive. But it doesn't have to, that list doesn't have to go on. So care is a malleable word. As Maggie Nelson and before her Wittgenstein remind us, its meaning is in its use. And how it is used now is certainly wide-ranging, as well as increasingly discussed. So recently, Andreas Hatzidakis and I have done some work on corporate care washing. And that's care washing is a term that he coined in the Care Manifesto and which has simply become more widely used. So care washing echoes other forms of corporate whitewashing, much like philanthrocapitalism. And we use it to refer to how corporations use the language of care to distract from their different degrees and forms of environmental and social exploitation. And we try to develop a taxonomy of it. So, for instance, our taxonomy includes the use of the pandemic by corporations to try to look like they care as a means to cash in on the mood shift towards mutuality. It also includes the form we term reputational, steamroller care washing, which is, we use that to mean aggressive forms of reputation management, claiming care in the face of widely publicised evidence to the contrary, which you might say is a form of disinformation, with parallels to that of fake news. And then we also discuss how corporations are attempting to increase their power by presenting themselves as rightful custodians of the social, of, for instance, the guardians and custodians of mental health or of education. So Dove, for instance, has produced packs for schools to educate and promote. So in the Gramscian sense, we can understand care washing as part of a passive revolution, perhaps, which is attempting to claim and to demarcate the realm of care for corporate capitalism and against socialism and social democracy. So the word care can be used against itself. It can be taken from us and used against us. And Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, her new book, is very good, I think, at pointing this out, pointing out how words can be twisted in this way. So she writes about how her book, The Shock Doctrine, which critiques corporations which exploit crisis in order to extend their own profits, became drawn on by far-right conspiracy theorists, what she calls the mirror world, which reflects and distorts. So no word can escape being contested. The use of words is always a struggle for meaning, and this regularly connects directly or indirectly to the struggle for social and political resources. So what should care mean? This is what we asked in the Care Manifesto. which is a short polemical book that I co-wrote with 4 other academics from different disciplines: Andreas Hatzidakis, Jamie Hakim, Catherine Rottenberg, and Lynn Siegel. And the book begins by outlining the crisis of care, pointing out that care has had centuries of being marginalised and devalued, of being left primarily to badly paid women, migrants, and working class people. And it discussed how this situation has combined with what we term the structural carelessness of 40 to 50 years of neoliberal failure. And the manifesto, as Ruth and Amy already mentions, kind of asks a very simple question. And what would it look like if instead we prioritised care? We shared out its burdens better, we revalued it, and we put it front and centre of life. So the book's very short and necessarily, doesn't get at everything by any means, but it tries to sketch some ideas for how we might do this, moving scale by scale from our intimate relations of care, like kinship, through communities and states and economies and environments, picking out examples and progressive and radical examples from the past and present along the way. So some of the arguments that we make include the importance of moving away from lonely, individualistic narratives of achievement and defensive self-interest to recognising our interdependence, which, as you can see, is in the subtitle, The Politics of Interdependence. So we kind of rejected earlier suggestions for it to be the politics of compassion, because we really wanted to emphasise this kind of interdependence dimension that's integral to care. And it can be, uncomfortable to do that. It can be uncomfortable to recognise our dependencies, can't it, as well? So we also argue that self-care needs to be treated as part of the effort to create more egalitarian societies, as Audre Lorde meant it in the first place, and not simply involving a series of retreats and scented candle purchases, however nice they may be. So we also discuss caring kinships, how mutual aid groups, whether during the early stages of the AIDS crisis or the COVID pandemic, can help show how wider kinship groups are not only possible, but preferable. So we argue, much like Sophie does, for expanding our imaginations and pluralising care for what we call, at one point, promiscuous care. And then we look at the thorny complexities of whether we can have a caring state, given how uncaring so much of it has been, both historically and in the present, but also how necessary, on the other hand, scaled up forms of socialised provision like the NHS and like the National Care Service that we urgently need. So we adopt a position that was once in the 70s described as in and against the state. And we also look at what is often involved in caring communities, whether green space, clean free water, free or cheap public transport, bread and roses, the importance of funding infrastructures on a collective level for mutual support at all different scales. So we argue that what we need to do is to roll back neoliberalism on every level, whether through mutual aid, cooperatives, local councils, national or international interventions and regulation. So we're arguing, in effect, for a mixed left economy, that we can't be too fussy, we need everything in the pot. And we're arguing for the importance of getting the private sector out of it as far as possible, further than we think is possible now, out of our essential services, first of all. That we need to move to insourcing instead of outsourcing, to re-socialise, for example, care homes, rather than letting asset management companies run inhumane provision for their shareholders. And you might say that also goes for all kinds of institutions like universities as well. You just need to look at how university boards have endless representatives from hedge funds. It also means letting our governments waste public money by funneling it to their rich friends, as the UK government did in the pandemic, and giving financial breaks to fossil fuel companies, which are destroying our ecological life support systems. So we have a very broad scope in a very short book, and the goal has been and still is to attempt to help shift the conversation and the action in order to help create infrastructures that make it possible for us to care by decommodifying, pluralizing, and socializing them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll just take it from here, shall I?
Amy was going to just do your little intro, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
No, it's fine, Sophie. Let me just do a quick intro. I've got to find it now, sorry.
Thank you so much, Jo, for that.
Great. So yeah, we're just about to hear from Sophie Lewis. And Sophie Lewis is a leading feminist critic and author of Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation, which critiques the nuclear family as a capitalist construct. Her first book, Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, called for mothering against motherhood on a societal scale. Based in Philadelphia, USA, Sophie teaches courses for the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and is an unpaid visiting scholar at the Feminist, Queer and Transgender Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. So yeah, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Ruth and Jo, for setting the stage so well. I'm not going to share slides today. Transparently, I did want to mark that I would say my heart is partly not here. Oh dear. Stop. That was my 15-minute alarm apparently going off immediately. Interrupting me saying that I'm divided. My heart's partly not here. I'm sure we're all in a similar boat, freaking out and grieving and raging, perhaps succumbing to despair because of the genocidal violence that a military wing of a settler colonial government full of self-described fascist elements is perpetrating in Palestine right now. But we have all shown up to be with each other today here anyway, though perhaps others who signed up and wish to be part of the conversation are on the streets at vigils and protests right now. For instance, in Philadelphia, where I live here, on occupied Lenape land, the activist networks that were out over the whole pandemic in defense of Black lives, Indigenous lives, unhoused people in Philadelphia especially, have sprung back into action, as we would expect, in the past 10 days to try and prevent the United States funding this Zionist Holocaust. And perhaps too, without wanting to seem too glib, perhaps too it is valuable and worthwhile in this moment to come together to engage problems of care internationally like this, including the destruction of basic conditions of care, which, just to make one final link, in the Palestinian context, obviously include even the fundamental ability to perceive certain populations as human and deserving of care. A video I watched today as part of my current frenzy of early morning anti-war posting cleverly began with the image of kittens salvaged by Palestinian children from the rubble of their homes, which concluded with the thought that Benjamin Netanyahu, having just referred to Palestinians as animals, it might be easier for the international community to perceive, to find it in their hearts to care, were the issue in fact an issue of kittens rather than of 2 million human beings, half of whom are children. And on that grim note, I'll sort of segue into what I was going to say originally. As well, I spent time, as Jo did, very near the Whitworth, doing a PhD at the university just up the road, and actually on one memorable occasion, joining the picket right across the road from the Whitworth, or more or less right across, in solidarity with the striking midwives, whose strike, as many of the workers well understood, exposed the knottiness and what I would almost call the ungraspable radicality of the social reproduction problematic that Marxist feminists sort of, as I see it, sort of blew open Marxist debates with in the 1970s. The way, just to share with you the way I see that sort of, the story I like to tell myself or students in about that moment was that whereas a beautiful sort of fairy tale that Marx himself tells in Capital, where he shows you the inside of the factory, sort of come with me, I'll show you the sort of violence of the meeting between capital and labor inside the factory, which shows us that all is not as it seems on the sort of sphere of appearances of liberal democratic society, where we freely choose to sell our labor, supposedly. What happened for me when the women of Wages for Housework, amongst others, you know, Silvia Federici, Maria Rosa della Costa, Leopoldina Fortunati, and others, they almost, in my mind, go to the back of the factory and show that there's another door, another curtain, and they show that behind this, there is in fact also a household with an unwaged sphere that is equally crucial to the circulation of value and the accumulation of value in capitalist society. And in that even more hidden abode of production, the abode where people we tend to call mothers do unwaged labor to reproduce the worker, who will then reproduce or will then produce the commodity. There is, in a sense, an impossible strike, a strike that has that may, in a sense, be literally impossible as far as we know to date. The autonomous theorist, already mentioned, Dalla Costa, of Wages for Housework, famously contended this, that there has never been a general strike, and we may not know whether there can be one. That question is left very much open for her, and I think still for us today, precisely for the reason that so much of the labor on which capitalism depends is too intimately interwoven with the survival of the opposite of capitalism, namely us, right? The webs of the living searching for freedom. And this is why the strike of the midwives was such a good education for so many of us in dialogue on that picket line. Because when the midwives, whose professionalized care responsibility involves pregnant people on the cusp of going into labor, and it involves, you know, tiny, fragile, radically care needy neonatal human beings, the idea that one might go on strike from that responsibility evokes moral alarm and condemnation, very understandably so, in a sense, right? And therefore, the phrase, as I recall, was, "We strike because we care." You know, the thought there, as you can already sort of intuit, is that one would not want people to think that someone in a profession that is caring might go on strike because, let's say, she doesn't want to care as much or to care in the way that wage labor organizes and circumscribes. The idea that someone might want to strike because they don't care is still one that we are leery of. So this phrase, we strike because we care, strikes me as very much like we are not a burden to each other, a handy sort of potted distillation of many as yet sort of unresolved contradictions of the politics of care. The phrase "we are not a burden to each other" gathers us, I think, as a sort of statement of defiance, a kind of communist, feminist, disability liberationist prayer, a hope, a dream, a prefiguration, as well as a simple truth, all at once. In this one phrase, we can pretty much locate all of the contradictions of capitalist care, the contradictions of capitalism as a way of organizing care, and also, therefore, the incipient sense in which care might be something we think of as an invading society of red love, in the sense of Raya Dunayevskaya and C.L.R. James's The Invading Socialist Society. So this invading society is an immanent sort of logic of anti-proprietary, non-instrumental, intimate relations. We are not a burden to each other. I mean, is it true, right? Well, no. And yes, depending on whether we take it to be a prescriptive claim and or a descriptive one, or rather, depending on from which standpoint we view it to be a description, right, of the truth of life on earth right now, or what Marxists call the present state of things, because everything about that would hinge on the definition of we in a society shaped so centrally by the relationship of class, and therefore shaped on both a local and a global scale by what Black anti-colonial feminists have called reproductive stratification. The billions of proletarianized, racialized, colonized, feminized human beings of the earth, as Evie Nakano-Glenn writes, are forced to care, right? They, or quote unquote, we, in uneven ways, are coercively tasked with the care of the few. One could say that low-income Filipinas, thinking of the United States in particular, where I live, low-income Filipinas are burdened, we might say, with the care of rich children and their families in the global north, and the care of the wealthy generally in the various enclaves of the north within the south, the north within the global south, right? The ruling classes, in turn, may not be burdened by each other, right? Simply because they can afford not to be, because they can outsource that sense of burdenedness. Bourgeois opinion often explicitly frames the rest of us, right? Especially the disabled and working class single mothers and children as unworthy or undeserving of collective support, be that in the form of tax contributions or even basic consent to the very existence of socialized infrastructures of healthcare, public transport, housing, or sanitation, for example. So I hope this hasn't all struck you as a sort of facetious picking apart of the phrase. It's coming from a place of deep respect for phrases that are so inspiring and impossible, in a sense, to integrate with the fabric of life as it currently tragically and enragingly sort of is. We are not a burden to each other. It sort of describes reality from a class standpoint. And that's, before we get into the multiple possible meanings of burden, a word which is thought to come to us etymologically from the Proto-Germanic "birthinjo," which is that which is born, and which speaks directly, to my eyes, therefore, to the blessing and the curse that is all living beings, sort of material and biological and social interimbrication. Speaking as a fellow with Joe, socialist, sort of eco-feminist, right? This, from me, deriving very much from the early work of Donna Haraway as a socialist biologist in the Cyborg Manifesto, very much speaking about the discomfort, not just the beauty, of that deep, deep interimbrication of all of us with everyone else. This, to me, is a very moving, yet also uncomfortable and unromantic fact. And I think I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that and then end. In my book, Full Surrogacy Now, which is about the work of gestating, and in the short pamphlet that followed it, which clarified, in a sense, the family abolitionist component of that book about gestating, and which argues for the deprivatization of care. I'm departing from the premise, in a sense, that we might indeed one day realize that sense in which we are not a burden to each other. The task being first to recognize that we already are the makers of one another for good and ill. Especially, perhaps, we need to focus on the unskillful ways in which we make one another in the image of class and in the image of nationalism and white supremacy and so forth. And by this, I'm sort of trying to work with others, work towards a deromanticization of the care framework, which very much asks, for instance, those engaged in mothering labor to appreciate that in the making of new human beings, we are at the same time creating a worker, amongst other things, for markets and bosses to sort of suck and extract from. And we're in the same exact moment helping form a potential comrade, but someone whose value is also not tied to their purpose or their function or their politics, shall we say. But that duality is what makes the strike of a midwife so impossible, amongst other things. When capitalism has captured our intimate sphere, the more hidden abode, as well as the more visible abode of production, the task is almost depressingly vast. This is why I think our reactions to propositions like, abolish the family, or propositions like wages for housework, are so visceral in all of us, right? The premise of wages for housework was often called economistic. These sort of immortal lines of their manifesto in the 70s began, they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. And the it there refers to everything from wiping your child's snotty nose to cooking and cleaning and shopping and emotionally rehabilitating your husband so that he can go back to the factory the next day. All of that is social reproduction. Now, the thing I really insist on at every possible opportunity is that we pay attention to the fact that they do not say that there is no love in that work. The manifesto begins, they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. It doesn't say, we say it isn't love. the whole misunderstanding of this politics as economistic. And by this politics, I mean, mine, I think ours, which urges us to look at the sense in which care is made burdensome in capitalist society, is trying to grasp the nettle, this almost unbearable fact that the social reproduction of capitalism and the social reproduction of our loves are woven too intimately and finely together. We can only begin to sort of unweave that implication and learn to be the makers of one another skillfully rather than to act, in a sense, in a way worthy of the already true fact that we are the makers of one another, if we can tolerate the heartbreak of actually addressing this head on. And so I'm grateful to you for this beautiful exhibition and the process that led into its making. And I'm very honoured to be invited into the mix so that we can take up this work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you both for such really thought-provoking and rigorous, interesting words. So now
before we ask anything, can we just encourage people to write some questions, to voice their questions in the chat on YouTube, and we will get those asked in this discussion. We really want this to open this out to everyone's thoughts, so don't be shy. We can read them out without your name and you won't let's all pitch in and make this a good dialogue.
We have had some thoughts. Ruth, I don't know whether you want to. There was just so much there. I'm just still also digesting everything you said.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could start with something that I was thinking about. Jo, you were talking about scale, and I thought that was really interesting. I feel like scale has come. We've been kind of zooming in and out in what you've both been saying, and I wondered if, like, Sophie, if you see it like that, if it's a case of kind of starting with our immediate relationships or kinships or kith, in order to be able, is it a point of starting here, or is it a point of that all of these things need addressing and that's one of them? Or do you see what I mean? Like, do you see this as a kind of scalable thing?
That's a very, very difficult question. I think yes. The painful edges of this kind of inquiry are often to do with the sort of, as I see it, the clash between the incontrovertible fact that very broadly, maybe over broadly, we all deserve more care, and the fact that and Kalindi Vora is very good on this in the book Life Support, which sort of looks at the ways that some people's, especially families' lives are supported along neo-colonial channels of provision, that there is a sense in which perhaps we might also need to contemplate certain types of care being stopped. So certain forms of care need perhaps to be abolished There's a sort of provocative sense in which, a student asked me one time whether I was so startled, whether I was saying abolish care, which I'd never even considered. But it is an interesting, I wonder what Joe's immediate reaction to that is. But I think what this student was saying was from a sort of anti-colonial perspective. There is a way in which so much of the sort of planetary infrastructure of care, amongst some of the things that it reproduces are, projects that expose us to premature death, for instance, the care of, I'm being very inarticulate here. The things that we care for include the giant sort of enemy infrastructures of humanity. Caring for some things perhaps inevitably involves blinding ourselves to the avenues necessary to care for otherwise worlds, for want of a better phrase. I'm hoping Joe can rescue me here as I flail.
No, that makes perfect sense. I guess my kind of visceral reaction is I don't particularly like abolish care, because I think there's just too much good in the word, even though, as you know, when I talked about the care washing, that kind of highlights how there's so many ways in which this term is used against itself, and for evil ends. So I can see how you could come with that as a provocation and do something interesting around it. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, how care is kind of sidled into the conversation a lot over the past 5 years or so. And that's, it's problematic. Like all words are volatile and they're malleable, and they can be seized upon and used for inegalitarian purposes. But I think there's so much there historically that is helpful and useful and nourishing and life affirming about the word, and it speaks to so much which has been pushed aside and devalued, that I still like the move to care, what's sometimes called the turn to care. And I guess the scales is interesting, isn't it, because we did know it's to a large extent quite an artificial structure, because it's when you just go from small to big, it's very linear. It kind of sidelines a lot of complexity, but every that's kind of, if you're looking at a small issue, it's always very complex unto itself, and so it's an artificial construct to some extent. But we kind of thought it was quite a good way in to talk about the larger issues.
Thank you both.
Great. Your kind of that real pinning down of the idea of care washing is so fascinating, in the way that the malleability of that word. So thanks so much for that. Amy, do you want to ask a question of your own before they are coming in now, excitingly?
They are coming in, yeah. No, I was going to ask about, both of you mentioned, to talk about the pandemic in those books that we mentioned, the Abolish the Family and the Care Manifesto. And and actually, we kind of came across the Care Manifesto, I think, when we were doing our projects about, made a podcast about feminist economics, and there was something in that time when we were reading it about this idea of the pandemic causing a rupture in the world, and that this is a point at which care, the conversation about care could change, and was being talked about in a different way, and at least, so I suppose I'm just wondering, from the point at which you kind of wrote that manifesto, and you know, since the sort of pandemic it's not finished, but it's, you know, since the kind of you know, the sort of lockdowns and the extraordinary kind of deaths that were happening all across the world, do you feel that conversation has been kept where it kind of perhaps was happening at that point? And also, you know, you sort of, Sophie, you were referencing the people in Philadelphia, the kind of communities who came together. And I suppose what I'm saying is, like, what did we learn from that terrible period? But also, has that rupture, has it been enough to kind of keep the care conversation happening, or how do we keep it happening, I suppose, as well? So it's to both of you, but
it's a great question, because, you know, the experience of the pandemic were very divergent, weren't they, depending on where you were, your pre-existent levels of privilege, your geography, your immune system, what kinship group you live with. So it's not unitary, was it? That's one important qualifier, I think. But yeah, it was a really powerful moment that in shifting the prism for so many people about what is socially important and necessary to sustain us, to shine a light on the support systems that we need, to revalue, you know, the people that manage to get us food, who manage to, you know, look after people in hospitals with inadequate PPE, to reevaluate our relationship with the people around us and with nature and the natural world, and to expose how caring, as you know, as a job, has been so disastrously valued socially, which again, you know, the PPE crisis in the UK really brings that home, didn't it? And the kind of the way in which working class people of colour in particular were on the front lines and disproportionately hit by COVID. So it kind of it shined that light, and it started, or kind of didn't start, but, you know, pushed forward a conversation about what kinds of care were important and what we should value and why. And I think, you know, just as with any moment, people from the left, from progressive movements, seized that and tried to use it to talk about what it could look like if we did things differently, if we centered care in you know, as we prioritized it as societies. But then at the same time, you have this bifurcation, don't you? Because at the same time, you have incredibly powerful corporations becoming vastly rich throughout the pandemic. You have, you know, a handful of predominantly men, rich white men, becoming astronomically wealthy, and corporate wealth exploding. So, but I still think, you know, you have to take whatever moment you have and push as progressive agenda as you can. And are we still in that moment? No, we're not exactly in that moment. The moment's always changing, but some of the lessons of that moment are still powerfully with us, and so too are the problems that moment exacerbated. So we're in a moment, I think, where there's both a kind of more cultural literacy and simultaneously more disaster to cope with at one and the same time.
Yeah. Sophie, I don't know if you want to talk about...
I'll mainly just say I liked what you said, you know, as you prompted us not to necessarily go on and on. I agree. I co-sign all of this. I'll just maybe just note that, you know, as the pandemic began, it was quite interesting and comical, frankly, for someone whose writings on the private nuclear household, the family, feminism, family values and the ways that family is bound up in the reproduction of capitalism had been somewhat ridiculed in the liberal mainstream before the pandemic. It was frankly quite easy to see that certain magazine and newspaper editors had literally experienced perhaps some of the shortcomings of the unassisted private nuclear households under lockdown, and then gone, who talks about that? And this sort of hit me up to weigh in for the first time. But then, of course, the thing that they actually wanted to hear was some sort of bastardized sort of, how do I abolish the family in 6 easy steps in the context of my life? And this is very much just to, since I haven't spoken so much about my little manifesto, and I wanted to get some misunderstandings out of the way and forgot to, I hope it's clear. The good and the bad news is that I fundamentally don't see this as something you do in sort of separately first, or in any way out of the context of revolutionization of social relations as a whole, and, if you like, the destruction of capitalism. So it's a sort of sine qua non. It doesn't, to abolish the family without abolishing capitalism would be to create a sort of massacre, or at least a crisis of starving infants at the very least. I'll stop there. But certainly the pandemic brought people's attention to the matter of the private organization of care, as Jo was already sort of pointing to. And I think there has been a dwindling of the significance of that politically.
Thanks, Sophie. That's a really helpful qualification, actually, of what you said earlier. So, yeah, thanks. Should we ask one of the questions? Should we just ask them in order that they come in? So, there's a question about, well, I'll just read it. What is the role of care when it comes to a global tragedy like we are sorry, I can't speak. What is the role of care when it comes to a global tragedy like we are witnessing? To care for is a certain form of power. How do we care when we have no power to impact care?
I think it's
very,
sort of
very succinctly then, and I'm sure you have more to say, Jo, but I really want to repeat the possibility that some forms of care in practice for the planet, for the dispossessed, for the colonized and those interned in open air concentration camps on their own land, might resemble things that intuitively to some of us wouldn't come into the frame of reference of the word care. It might, to give a sort of perhaps an intermediary example, Deep Care is a book coming out by the queer feminist historian Angela Hume, and it's about abortion, right? Very much in line with the things I've been trying to say since Roe versus Wade was overturned last year, that it's a bitter pill, not necessarily strategically being taken up everywhere, but some radical abortion collectives are saying a similar type of thing, that the way to understand gestational autonomy and fight for it in a coherent and perhaps finally successful sense may be to understand that, yes, there is an unpretty, perhaps one could say even a violent dimension to deep care, by which I mean when we gestate and we choose to exit from that labor, we do in a sense kill an organism, a form of living, fetal or embryonic existence. And the debate, at least where I'm standing, turns over and over and over again on the question of whether it's killing or not. Whereas care politics in many different forums, and I think abortion might be a way to educate our ability to think this contradiction, involves perhaps quite sort of brutal types of action, right? When we destroy infrastructure that destroys the earth, for example, when we blockade pipelines or decommission military bases, there might be a form of violence involved in this. And it could be, as Angela Hume suggests, be called deep care. So I hope that somewhat answers the question.
That's a really great book title, and it's a really interesting problematic to think with, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I see that point, and on the other, it's that they don't seem to be huge violences when you, for example, compare that zygote to what a fully fledged child would experience in a world that it didn't want, no one wanted to bring it into, or what the parent would experience, what the mother would experience, perhaps under conditions of such hardship. So that's in a way, I kind of both see the complexity and the need. It kind of points to me to need to kind of reinstate that is care at the same time. And similarly with the horrific violence happening in the Middle East at the moment, in Gaza, that points to the necessity to point out that war crimes are not care, they're the opposite. And not leaving over 2 million people without fresh drinking water is not care. It is a fundamental abdication of care, and that seems important to point out as well.
Yes, thank you both.
In a way, I just wanted to say, I think you're saying something really deep there as well, Joe, about as I would almost paraphrase it, maybe, I think Frantz Fanon has something along these lines that I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe we agree, maybe we don't. But the premise that you made me think of was that non-violence is not an available option in all circumstances in the existing state of things. What we can be is anti-violence, which might seem like an odd distinction, but if you think about it, anti-violent movements might might have no option but to traffic in certain forms of violence, which I agree with you, we would want to perhaps not even call violence compared to the alternative, but which perhaps strategically we might also want to not waste all of our time denying the violence of, because of this premise that non-violence is not an option for many of us in many contexts.
Yeah, I completely see that. And also with the examples that you give, there's kind of distinction, isn't there, about the type of violence. So they're not necessarily violence against
right
human,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the examples you give about care washing resonate so closely with some of the examples I like to analyze about the deployment of family, which in a way is it's almost the same thing sometimes, or it overlaps hugely. We are all family here at British Airways, yes, or whatever, which, it's a silly joke in a way, but when you look at statistically where you are most likely to be treated really poorly, especially if you're a queer youth, but if you're a woman or a child, if you were to God forbid, be sexually abused, or if you're a woman, murdered, the most likely place where that's going to happen to you is the family. So you would think that if you're a customer somewhere, they might not choose to bring in the rubric of family, that, if someone says to you, we're going to treat you like family, you might be like, oh, I hope not. That would actually and then what I'm saying there is that I'm not just being stupid and glib, I hope. I'm understanding family as a dream, almost a utopian one. We want to belong. We want to have forms of unconditional provision and nurturance. abolition is the right word for what I want and what I think you want, what I understand the care collective to want, because of its dialectic structure as a word. When we abolish something, we don't just negate and destroy it, but in a weird sense, we preserve and realize its inner kernel, the inner desire that's being travestied in the present for the first time. So sort of the perhaps going back to that student's really provocative, maybe wrong sort of proposal that we abolish care, perhaps something about that could be understood as a turning inside out of the current sort of capitalist and colonial dispensation of care, the way it's currently organized, to sort of realize the dream of care in some sense. I hope I'm not derailing.
No, that makes perfect sense, and that makes me I agree, and I also think that it also makes some of the conversations around that they depend on who you're speaking to, don't they? Because some people have an available language already, say, of abolition, and to other people it just mean, it doesn't necessarily mean build up community structures and extended families. It just sounds like burn it down, so it depends. The conversation sometimes needs to be bigger or smaller or different, depending on the context. Maybe that's obvious.
And we have another question here, which is more kind of going into sort of economics of economic systems. Could you speak to some real-world examples of strategies or models that counter the capitalist care system? So, for example, Jo, you had an example of insourcing. So, are there any others that you think that you could give an example of and talk through?
Yes. Yes. So, for example, insourcing. So, one strategy is bringing back into, say, local council public ownership that which has been sold off and sold out to the private sector and bartered and used as a football of debt for the financial elite. So there are examples of local councils. It's very difficult for them because obviously the budget's been slashed by nearly half over the past 10 years. But in the UK, some councils trying to do that work of insourcing, and perhaps like the kind of one of the most well-known examples is Preston. So which Rhiannon Jones has written a really good book with Matthew Brown, the leader of Preston Council. It's called Paint Your Town Red. So I guess a lot of people will know that here. But it's really interesting kind of, it talks about what Preston's done to try and build the community in a collectivist fashion around around anchor institutions to kind of do community wealth building, which also has kind of tentacles to the states and to the kind of municipal movements in Europe. So there's a lot of kind of great examples in there. They have a kind of step-by-step guide of how to paint your town red. And then there's also, similarly kind of really interesting cooperative projects and kind of municipal projects, which don't always succeed, but a lot of them do. And there's a lot of stuff being written about at the moment on that. So but Fearless Cities, for example, a kind of book, the New Municipalism, a lot of activity in that area. The book called Community Wealth Building as well. Yeah. Sophie?
Co-sign all of that. I'm disconnected from UK politics. I never grew up in the UK either. I don't really want to start weighing in on US stuff to make it all. But I broadly speaking, I think it's important to understand, exactly as Joe was just evoking, that bread and butter sort of socialist politics are care politics necessarily. I mean, I would provocatively also say that most sort of left causes and projects and sort of certainly like social democratic demands are perversely sort of family abolitionist in a certain way, by which I mean that if you listen to the right wing, so I mean there are certainly quite scary right wingers in the UK, but there are many in the US. And if you listen to them, they're actually, in a sense, I would say, almost more honest than some liberals about the consequences of social welfare to the primacy of family values as they see it. So, people will completely explicitly say that they oppose child benefits because it might erode the male breadwinner's sense that he provides, for the family. And so, but this is one of the big contradictions, right? That's where the right agrees that the left wants to abolish the family and feminism wants to abolish the family, according to the right. And I sort of say, yeah, like in the 70s, it was less controversial to say this. If you think about people like Black anti-colonial radicals like Pat Parker at the Oakland Women's Center, she was fully about family abolition, right? And on the other hand, the paradox is that, care policies, in perhaps, family abolitionist pointing type policies can also be described as pro-family policies, right? The Working Families Party, like in the US, right, is a party that stands for all the sorts of things that, like, provide for people, for working class people. So you can say the same sorts of things almost in opposite ways, is the paradox, right? But I am always, I mean, maybe this is sort of my role in these conversations, for better or for worse, for now, as a sort of queer utopian, it's to say, what are we losing when we limit ourselves to the language, or when we choose every time, without necessarily thinking about it, the language of family? So when we march for an end to the inhuman border policies of our governments, do we always, need to say keep families together and stop family separations in order to oppose the dehumanizing treatment of migrants? If maybe, right, maybe in some contexts that's the right strategic choice, but who do we throw under the bus potentially? What queer migrants who shouldn't be united unconsensually with their families are we perhaps leaving out and throwing? What are we gaining by using that frame that in a way maybe shores up the false idea that if you just family enough, right, if you just respectability enough, you will be allowed passage into this great nation of civilized values, right? Which is a nice story.
I guess I'm also interested, do you ever use the language of, say, decentering the nuclear family or reconfiguring the family as well?
Yeah, I think yeah, I do, and several of us sort of have thought about this. There used to be a phrase I was doing, like sort of real families against the family. Yeah, certainly, decentering, or the language of beyond as well, rather than against, or sure. And I want to be clear as well, that this abolish the family language does obviously have points of contact with movements, I hope, and I know. And for instance, abolishing family policing, the sort of big movement for decarcerating society, deinstitutionalizing mental illness, talking about disability liberation a lot. There's a sort of language of the false opposition between kinship care in the family, and care in the state, which disabled, sort of severely disabled people face, for instance, which is a binary that many activists are trying to problematize. You know, why is that the binary, right? It's you're your family's problem, or you're the ward of the state, and that there aren't any other options, right? That's a naturalized premise of certain policy discussions that one might want to trouble as well. Thinking actually to what Melinda Cooper, the historian, says about the deep origins of this idea that family is the source of final and maybe exclusive responsibility for the destitute or the indebted, for example, because in the Middle Ages, she says, the poor laws helped the process of enclosure that sort of privatized care and sort of helped kickstart capitalism by creating the private nuclear household, in part by saying for the first time that the vagrant and the destitute were the responsibility of kin, not of the commons, and not of the collective, which I find really, really interesting. But yeah, yeah, I should shut up.
Who was that you just said?
Melinda Cooper.
Melinda Cooper, okay.
Family Values is her book about the paradoxically quite central position of the family in the thought and governance of both neoconservatives and neoliberals. But yeah, I mean, the activists who are involved in abolishing family policing and child protective services in the US are increasingly really interested in what it would mean to sort of abolish family policing, which is sort of take the boot of the state off the neck of certain racialized kinship formations, while at the same time, if you like, abolishing the family, which means not naturalizing a particular kinship formation. And that's actually, it sounds like contradictory or difficult, but in fact, people have been doing it for a long time. In abolitionist circles in the US, when I get down to it, that's what some people have been saying to me.
I don't know whether we've got time for one more question or not.
We've got 4 minutes. Maybe we could just squeeze this one in that might be just to Jo, which is because it's about what you were talking about self-care and the co-option of care into the self-care movement. So the question is, I think it'd be interesting to talk about care as a popular Instagram movement, especially when self-care is such a vastly capitalized notion. And the current internet landscape is so bewildering because on one hand there is news of genocide, and then there are wellness psychologists who are providing bite-sized tools to have a good day, which actually derails us from larger conversations around care as a collective movement of resistance. Do you have anything to come to that, Jo?
Yeah, that's a big topic, isn't it? I'm trying to think of a way in. I wrote a piece on housework as care on Instagram, and Mrs. Hinch, where we tried to kind of peel apart some of the kind of fetishization of the family that goes on to connect to your stuff, Sophie, and also the kind of re-fetishization of the Fordist housewife on there. At the same time as she actually does all this labor of, it's a kind of whole labor, isn't it, to produce Instagram content. So
there's a housewife movement, isn't there, at the moment?
Yeah, the trad wife movement, which I think you've written about as well, Sophie. So yeah, there's lots of different layers there, aren't there? There's the kind of wellness layer, which Naomi Klein writes about that really interestingly in her new book as well, and Stephanie Baker has written about it in a book called Lifestyle Gurus. There's a whole lot to talk about there, and then there's the kind of the capitalist platformization, isn't there, of the medium and the attendant problems and the kind of problems of being an influencer and a content producer and trying to, the commodification of the self that goes on within that political economy. So there's a lot there. There's probably more than the 2 minutes I think we have left.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe the event.
Thank you for those pointers. I hope everyone's taking notes because it's really helpful just to point this to other people who've explored that more fully.
So I think we have come to the end of our time now, but I think Ruth and I would like to say a massive thank you to Jo and Sophie for such inspiring and interesting talk, and also brilliant conversation, and thank you to everybody who's come along and for your questions. And of course, thank you to the Whitworth for hosting the event, and to Poppy and Holly for helping us organise it. Ruth, do you want to quickly say anything that I might have not said?
No, I think this has been recorded and it will go on YouTube, so you can then share it with other people, the discussion afterwards. So yeah, thanks very much for such a fantastic, generous conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if Poppy, are you coming back in? Yes, she's coming back in.
Hello, yeah, thanks. I'm just here to also add my thanks to all four of you, Ruth and Amy, for holding, for creating the idea for this event and holding tonight's discussion, and for Jo and Sophie for your really incredible contributions. It was such a far-reaching, very deep-rooted conversation, and I think, Sophie, you started by saying that care, its meaning, it's in its use, and I think you've both taken us through the many different spaces in which that term is used and misused, both in recent history and very much in the current moment. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your contributions, and thank you for being so generous with your references. So it's given us, myself, and I'm sure everybody listening, so much more to take from this and to carry on thinking through your ideas. Thank you both. And we'll leave it there, I think.